Great. Okay. So, like I said, my name is Anna Stablum. I work at ClimeCo. It's an environmental solutions provider. And we are in 3 ranges of business. We do ESG reporting and sustainability advising. We do a lot of carbon accounting, which I'm sure many of your firms will start embarking on as you are part of other people's supply chains. And we're also developing carbon projects. So we have one shipping project that I will tell you a little bit about in a few minutes that maybe you're interested in, and that is really to support the decarbonization of the shipping industry. We also trade voluntary carbon credits and RECs, and yeah, I just wanted to share first a little bit about what is really the voluntary carbon markets. As I'm sure a lot of you are very aware of the EU ETS scheme at this point, because obviously shipping is now one of the industries that comes under the EU ETS, together with the industries that is obviously close to your heart as well, manufacturing and aircraft operators. So the ETS is very different from the voluntary market. Basically you have a cap, and this cap will be smaller and smaller every year. This is obviously some numbers that have been set by, in this case, the European Union or the countries that are part of the scheme. So it allows emitters to, with lower emissions, to basically sell their allowances to higher emitters, and that's how we get the market price. So at this point we have an EUA price that is traded on ICE. It also means that you have speculators that have come in to provide liquidity in this market. So whereas the EU ETS is a top-down approach, the voluntary carbon markets is really a bottom-up approach with companies rather than industries taking action. They're very aligned to the Paris Agreement that countries, of course, 196 different parties signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was endorsed and came into force 2016. And as I'm sure you're very well aware, Singapore has set themselves the net zero target for 2050. So there are other companies that are then aligning with this. The goal for the Paris Agreement is to hold global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So net zero, of course, means cutting greenhouse gases as much as you possibly can. With the residual emissions, they have to be absorbed by something or someone else. So either you can have direct air capture, which is very expensive, or for example, you can use mangrove trees, because mangroves sequester a lot of carbon. So these projects, you basically need to report to registries with these projects. They're a bit like a central bank, and then issue voluntary and they're called verified emission reductions to make sure basically that these savings have happened. So what's the difference with the EU ETS allowance? Is basically that's a permit to pollute versus the EU ETS, versus the VER, sorry, that basically shows that the historical absorption or avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions going into the air. There are instances where these two markets meet, so that's what we have here in Singapore. We have a carbon tax. I'm sure you're all familiar. You can pay 5% of your carbon tax with voluntary carbon credits, and there are other places like the EU ETS where these markets are not meeting, so you're not allowed to use the VERs under your EU ETS obligations. So now I will give you an example of how it works. So ultimately here the idea is that we have one atmosphere, and as a market-based approach would suggest, we will basically start with the cheapest ways to reduce our emissions and work our way up the abatement cost curve. So it means that basically someone who can reduce their emissions quicker and cheaper should get the financing first, whereas the other industries will continue to work on their technologies to basically reduce their emissions in a little bit of a slower pace. Obviously, it means that everyone has to try and reduce their emissions, as we're all under the Paris Agreement. In this example, I basically put up a steel factory. It can be any hard-to-abate industry, but steel is obviously one of them. They have tried to reduce their emissions as much as possible, but ultimately they cannot reduce their emissions more, or what they would have to do is to pay a really high price. So just for an example, they would pay $500 to reduce the next ton of CO2. On the other hand, we have a shipping company that can install retrofits at a relatively low cost. And what happens is that the steel plant then agrees to fund the retrofit of this shipping company, and they get a carbon credit in return. It basically means that they can lower emissions at a lower cost than the $500. And in the meantime, like I said, both companies, of course, will continue to reduce their emissions. I hope that was clear enough. So otherwise, why use voluntary carbon credits? We have heard about ESG here on stage, and you know that there's more and more regulation coming into place. So here in Singapore, for example, we now have the requirement for large listed companies to do carbon accounting, to write a sustainability report, and that will go wider, so even non-large listed companies will have to do sustainability reporting and understand what their emissions look like. And even SMEs here in Singapore will be forced to write sustainability reports. This is obviously because these smaller companies sit in the value chain of these larger companies, and the larger companies will ask them, what are your emissions? Because I will need to file my sustainability report. So we also have these various frameworks that people are signing up to. So for example, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or the SBTi. The Science-Based Target Initiatives have now got around 4,000 companies that have signed up. They are working to reduce their emissions in accordance to this 1.5 degree pathway. And the SBTi really encourages you to consider historical emissions and to fund high-impact projects outside of your value chain. So beyond value chain mitigation is basically that you should be buying and retiring high integrity carbon credits, and they came out last week as well to talk about Scope 3 emissions, that basically any company that signs up to the SBTi we will know more details in July, but will be able to buy carbon credits to offset their Scope 3 emissions, basically emissions that you are not in control of. So it's estimated actually that the world's top 1,700 top emitters, if they compensated around 10% of their annual unabated value chain emissions, we could get $1 trillion in finance and protect nature by 2030. And I'm sure you might be aware, or maybe not, that nature-based solutions can actually provide up to 1/3 of the mitigation required by 2030 to keep the Paris Agreement target in reach. What we've heard as well from stage is obviously all the banks and the bankers looking at sustainability when they are deciding if they're going to lend companies money or not. These are very important, of course, as a company, if you want to go to the bank to get money, and it seems to be quite hard to do so. And it's just going to get harder because the banks themselves will have to report their Scope 3 emissions, like I said, and those are the financed emissions. What I also wanted to say is obviously that we need to build a marketplace. If we're going to get to net zero by 2050 or even earlier, there will be these residual emissions that you will need to fund a project. Someone else needs to take care of them. And it means that basically we need to build a marketplace. We need to get everyone involved already now to do so. So here are companies that are involved in the voluntary carbon space. This is only from January, that companies have been retiring credits. It basically means that you have then offset your emissions. You can see ClimeCo is there as well. It comes from this whole greenwashing, green hushing, that people don't want to put their name out there for buying voluntary carbon credits. Unfortunately, they haven't really read the latest stories and studies that buyers of carbon credits are 3 times more likely to have an approved science-based climate target, and they're 3 times more likely to include Scope 3 emissions in their climate targets rather than non-buyers. Buyers are also twice as likely to have reported lower gross emissions year on year related to reduced emissions or renewable energy consumption. So, I'm aware of my time here. There are different types of carbon credits, and you can see them here. What they all have in common is that under the voluntary carbon registries that we have, they need to be additional. It means that the project or these emission reductions would not have happened without money from the voluntary carbon markets. They need to be permanent, so basically it has to be no reversals, and you have to have measures in place to limit the risk of reversals. You also have to be very mindful that it's just one party that are issuing these credits and that they're only being used once to avoid double counting. So lastly, and I'm still within time, so that's good. So ClimeCo, together with Marsoft, the shipping consultants, basically came up with carbon credits to reduce the greenhouse gases from the shipping industry. And as you know, they account for around 3% of global emissions. And it's a very difficult sector, of course, to make greener. So what we did was we came up with a model together with MIT. It's called Green Screen, and it's really easy to measure the carbon emissions from ships. So you have a ship, we can count what kind of carbon emissions look like today. We can, in the model, put in, if you have retrofits that you want to install, we can count quite easily what the reduction of greenhouse gases would be. And you would then go to the bank and hopefully you would get some support and you would get the retrofits installed. We will, after a year, count the greenhouse gas savings that you have made after this installation, and we will take all that data to Gold Standard, one of the key registries in the voluntary market, and we will get carbon credits issued. As most ship owners are not in the market for selling carbon credits, ClimeCo will sell them on your behalf, and we will basically give part of the revenue back to the ship owner. So this means that the payback time for the loan that you might have taken when you were installing the retrofits, that payback time will now be shorter. So we have signed up quite a lot of ship owners already, so we have around 800,000 tons at this point. That's the latest number. And we're, of course, looking for more ship owners to sign up. But even more important, we're looking for market participants to, of course, support the work that can be done in the shipping industry, such as retrofits, to actually make this sector a little bit greener and a little bit more environmentally friendly. So, yeah, I don't know if we've got time. I've been trying to keep to my 15 minutes. I've got 2 minutes left. If there are any questions, or otherwise, I'm happy to take questions outside. Thank you.